The Mexican and Cuban revolutions are two revolutions that were heavily portrayed to the outside world through art and music in various forms. The use of art and music as propaganda and political criticism influenced the way in which people responded to the revolutions, and as such, there is lingering controversy over some aspects of them. That being said, art and music led to identity and unity of the revolutionary masses during these times and strengthened their culture and traditions. In this project, we hope to demonstrate how influential art and music were during the Mexican and Cuban revolutions, while also highlighting some key differences between the uses of these media forms during both struggles for change.
The Cuban Revolution is directly connected to Cuba's musical heritage as it is intertwined musical passion, an influential voice, hope, and often Cuban nationalism. Fidel Castro claimed in 2000 that neoliberal economic policies and corporate globalization create the neoliberal race to catastrophe that has cultivated the poverty and suffering in third world countries. The complete rejection of capitalism, because it openly welcomed inequality, was popular throughout Latin America since neoliberalism had left them desperate and hopeless. However, we often see many U.S. criticisms of the Cuban Castro-led regime as a failed state. Yet, Cuban music spreads, unifies, and reminds Cubans of the inherent goals to the revolution. In the 1960s and 70s, Nueva Trova, or the New Song movement, surged in the spirit of the revolution. Nueva Trova represented Cuban influence and gave hope to other struggling countries, as the revolution represented equality, as it created a Cuban identity, and a revitalization of nationalism from the revolution. Thus, Nueva Trova spurred from the original Trova music. Trova was folk-like music which required three characteristics. First, the song should be written by the performer to ensure its originality and emphasize its passion. Second, the song should be sang while playing a guitar. And third, it should be poetic in nature. However, Nueva Trova brought a new dynamic. It challenged the commercial and foreign domination of the airwaves with authentically local and meaningful music. It beautifully embodied the spirit of the revolution, creating unity and molding a Cuban identity. One of the influential artists of Nueva Trova was Carlos Puebla. In his most famous song, Hasta Siempre, Comandante, he writes, "Your revolutionary love is taking you to new places, where they await the strength of your arms and liberation." Puebla depicts the aspired proliferation of the revolution to the marginalized people of Latin America and Africa after Che Guevara left Cuba. Cuba represented hope for other countries as its revolutionary leaders attempted to rid Cuba of the poverty and suffering created by economic policies motivated by neoliberalism. Another Puebla song, Y en eso llega Fidel, he writes, "Here they wanted to continue. They wanted to continue taking everything for themselves, having luxurious houses, and making people suffer and continuing in a cruel way to conspire against the people, to continue exploiting them. And then Fidel arrived." This type of lyrical rhetoric is not only poetic in its nature in the original Spanish text, but brilliantly depicts the attitudes of Cubans in this period. Despite the classic anti-communist rhetoric perpetuated through the U.S. history books, listening and feeling the passion and hope created by the revolution inspires a listener to feel optimistic to Cuba's future now that their savior, Fidel Castro, had arrived. These lyrics and Nueva Trova music in general provides Cubans with comfort in knowing change has arrived, consequently refuting the classic Western anti-communist rhetoric of an oppressive and controlling regime that leaves all of its people unhappy. Nueva Trova gives a voice to the revolution and to the desires of the Cuban people. Next, as Nueva Trova faded during the 80s, Cuban rap and hip-hop emerged in the 90s. Cuban rap encompasses a wide variety of artists from commercially oriented and apolitical groups to more edgy underground groups. The state promoted commercially oriented rap as a way of diluting rap's radical potential. Rap became a state-sponsored vehicle to perpetuate nationalism and develop the Cuban Revolution. Even within underground hip-hop that criticized the government, the music was made to unify and strengthen revolutionary ideals. The criticisms of the government were constructive and aimed to revert the revolution back to its original ideas and values, equality through eliminating poverty and suffering. These goals were embodied by the early revolutionary figure Che Guevara, who became an icon for Cuban hip-hop. The rapper Coquino and the popular group Anónimo Consejo, or Anonymous Consent, tattooed a portrait of Guevara on his shoulder. In a song by the same group, they can be quoted, "Wake up, people. Revolution, my friend. It's time for justice. Revolution, my friend. Anonimo consejo. Revolution, my friend." It is important to understand that despite U.S. rhetoric on the restrictiveness of Cuban censorship, much of Cuban hip-hop functions as a revolutionary project that develops, improves, and reminds Cubans of their revolutionary goals. Hip-hop creates a unified national identity and perpetuates state ideologies in accordance with the Cuban Revolution. The revolution hinged on developing a Cuba that was strong and independent, and to become a nation that could eliminate poverty and suffering. The revolution inspired a non-Western and non-democratic pursuit of the people's desires in Cuba. Music helps create a stronger community that perpetuates revolutionary goals and instills hope in Cubans. This makes music indispensable to the efforts of the revolution because the Cuban identity comes from a strong sense of community.
The Cuban Revolution produced many forms of artistic expression. Much of the art produced following the Cuban Revolution came in the form of propaganda posters commissioned and distributed by the Cuban government in various forms. The government commissioned these forms of graphic art to promote Castro's socialist government and its various political and economic messages. The goal of these posters was to promote unity among people and give them cultural figures and messages to identify with. This in turn promoted the formation of a shared cultural identity. These posters marked the most prominent display of art during the post-revolutionary period due to the cultural policies of Castro's government. Many artists fled Cuba to avoid censorship and have more artistic freedom. Some stayed, and many produced pro-revolutionary and pro-Castro propaganda posters after the revolution. The Cuban Revolution produced a massive cultural revolution in graphic art, film, literature, and dance. However, there were both positive and negative aspects to this due to the development of the Cuban government's cultural policy. Aviva Chomsky notes in her book, A History of the Cuban Revolution, virtually everybody who studies culture in Cuba confronts the apparent paradox in revolutionary cultural policies and developments. On one hand, the revolution has fostered, democratized, and contributed to all areas of culture in ways unprecedented in Latin American history. On the other hand, the revolution has controlled, censored, and restricted cultural production to the extent that numerous authors and artists have chosen exile, and many Cubans complain about the limits on what they can read, listen to, see, or do. In other words, many of the different forms of art produced, including the graphic art propaganda posters, were in favor of the new Castro government and its ideology. Therefore, any artwork distributed was a form of propaganda. Propaganda is art with a specific political purpose, to promote a political figure and the political and social ideology of that figure. The propaganda posters, produced by the post-revolutionary Cuban artists, had a dramatic impact on graphics art and design. One well-known piece of propaganda was a poster of Che Guevara designed in 1968 by Alfredo Ruscard, based on an iconic photograph of Guevara by Alberto Corda, Guerrillero Heroico. Ruscard was a Cuban artist well known for producing political posters. Corda was a famous Cuban photographer. The poster features the face of Guevara with a rainbow of various colors coming from his head. Guevara was a very important figure during the revolution, and a symbol of the revolution and reform. This was not the only poster that the photograph inspired. Corda's photograph became a basis for many propaganda posters associated with the Cuban Revolution. Ruscard's poster, based on Corda's photograph, was one of many that depicts famous figures associated with the revolution. By promoting these figures, such as Guevara and Castro, they are also simultaneously promoting the ideology and messages of these figures as well. Guevara became a prominent figure in the Cuban government and also a diplomat that traveled the world promoting Cuban socialism. Guevara also believed in agrarian land reform and educational reform. While these ideas weren't necessarily depicted in the image, the goal of the propaganda is to promote the figure. When promoting the figure, the observer also associates the ideology and message of that figure. The Cuban people are the intended audience of the propaganda poster. The goal is to glorify the revolutionary figure of Guevara. Another iconic figure depicted in Cuban propaganda art of the time was Fidel Castro. Castro was the subject of much of the graphic art during and after the revolution because he was one of the major leaders. Much of the propaganda posters featuring Castro show him in some form of power position. Another well-known graphic artist who produced Cuban propaganda posters was Felix René Medeiros Pasos. He produced two very notable posters of Fidel Castro in the 1970s to commemorate the revolution. One shows a young Castro with a gun in his hand and his hand forward. The poster depicted him during the Moncada uprising in 1953. The second poster shows an older Castro holding up his gun to celebrate the victory during the Cuban Revolution with his fellow militants behind him. Both posters depict Castro as a powerful, victorious figure. Colors employed in both posters to enhance them and make them more visually attractive. They serve as very effective forms of propaganda because they depict Castro as a powerful, unifying leader. This in turn promotes Castro's ideology and vision for Cuba. The audience is assumed to be the Cuban people. The artist's goal is to promote Castro as both a leader and historical figure and glorify his strength and resolve in both victory and defeat.
Music is a form of expression that in many occasions manages to combine events, feelings, and perceptions of each moment of our lives. From each letter and or melody emerge moments that can explain in a short time the smallest detail of a story that needs to be told. Mexico is home to some of the most diverse music in the world, celebrating the local culture throughout the country. Influenced by Mexico's people and their past, it celebrates life and love. It talks of history, legends, and overcoming oppression. Above all, it is a vibrant part of Mexican life. Dating back more than 1,000 years before any contact was made with Europeans in the 16th century, the area was dominated by the Aztec culture, a culture that maintained an important and complex musical tradition. You may be asking, the history of Mexico through songs? That's right, among corridos, dance songs, and strong voices, the history of the Mexican Revolution has been told from multiple perceptions, from female participation in the armed struggle, to every battle, every fallen soldier, or rebel. The Mexican corrido is a popular musical genre of fundamentally combative character, the most committed to the social causes of the revolutionary movement, and therefore anonymous and subversive. In its origins, the corridistas were accompanied by different instruments like the guitar, a guitarrón, or a harp, and its main function was to spread fresh news. They transmitted from mouth to mouth important events of the various stages of our history. They included battles, heroes, successes, and defeats. In Mexico's Revolution, Then and Now, Cockcroft, the author, states on the section called Destructing of Families, the original peoples and women rise up, the right and the church counteract. Adelitas fought in Pancho Villa's division of the North during the Revolution. For 2 months in 2006, the Adelitas were the main force of the huge and historical sit-in along the Paseo de la Reforma and side streets near Mexico City's huge downtown plaza, the Zócalo, in demand of a vote recount in recognition of the electoral victory of el presidente legítimo López Obrador. La Adelita is one of the most famous representative corrido of the Mexican Revolution. It was composed in honor of all the women who participated in the Revolutionary War. Since then, an Adelita has come to signify a woman soldier, or soldadera, as well as a brave woman. La Adelita is the story of a woman that follows a surgeon into battle because she's in love with him. She is brave and beautiful, and was the kind of woman that would ride with her surgeon in a train or horse with a rifle or pistol ready and serving the troops. But she had the respect of the entire battalion, starting with the surgeon, who would sing, "If Adelita were to leave with another man, I would follow her over land and sea, over the sea by worship, over land in a military train, and if I die in battle, and they are going to bury my cadaver, Adelita, in God's name, I pray that you will cry for me." Whether the original Adelita existed or not, the name signified any woman who followed her man to war. Whether she rode on the train with him, rifle blazing, or on her horse, Mariachis who emerged from the revolution adopted Adelita as one of their favorite tunes, and it became a folk song over the years.
Mexico's revolution in the early 1900s was one of, if not the first, revolution to be thoroughly and extensively documented through the use of photography, art, literature, film, and music. People outside of Mexico were able to get a glimpse of what was going on there and imagine for themselves what life was like. Art and photography specifically captured the revolutionary spirit of Mexico during this time, and both areas were crucial in providing a lens for outsiders to see into Mexico. José Guadalupe Posada, Diego Rivera, and Frida Kahlo are three revolutionary artists whose artwork inspired generations to come and detailed specific events from the revolution, along with the photographs of Las Adelitas, which captured the prominent role of women soldiers during the revolution. Posada, a Mexican political printmaker and engraver, died in 1913, 3 years into the Mexican Revolution. He is most well known for his calaveras and his use of skulls and skeletons to make political and social critiques, but today his calaveras are associated with El Dia de los Muertos instead of having strong political associations. His most famous calavera, La Catrina, was meant to satirize the upper class during the reign of Porfirio Diaz, which was before the Mexican Revolution. Posada's artwork demonstrated how the Mexican Revolution was a confrontation between social classes. As Cockcroft wrote, quote, "The revolution of 1910 to 1917 was an explosive confrontation between social classes that pitted peasants and workers against landlords and capitalists," end quote. This is exemplified in Posada's satires of Mexican government. Quote, "He described with originality the spirit of the Mexicans, the political matters and daily life," end quote, among other aspects. He also worked in collaboration with many local newspapers during the Mexican Revolution in order to ensure that his politically satirical comments were published and to do his part in support of the revolution. Diego Rivera is another Mexican artist who was painting during the time of the Mexican Revolution. Although he was only in Mexico for the first year of the revolution, his work reflected the discussion of art and the effect it had on revolutions in general. One of Rivera's most famous works, which is part of the Mexican mural movement in the United States, reflects the relationship between Mexico and the United States in more recent times. The United States is notorious for sending military aid to, quote, "failed nations," end quote, and this is what happened during the Mexican Revolution. This in turn caused strained relations between most of the Mexican population and the United States. As Cockcroft explains, quote, "All of Washington's propaganda backs up the militarization of Mexico in order to protect the interests of the transnational corporations and foreign banks. The militarization is the revival of the dirty wars of the 1970s, especially in the states of Chiapas, Oaxaca, Guerrero, and Michoacán," end quote. Rivera's mural work in the United States was most often seen as controversial and profane. His murals brought into question his political stance, and a majority of his work was taken down, showing the still strained relations between the U.S. government and the people of Mexico. Frida Kahlo, a Mexican painter born in 1917, was very influential during this time as well. Her work is distinctive in that she was painting after the time of the Revolution, and she mostly did self-portraits. She would often lie about her age so that she was more directly associated with the revolution, but even so, her artwork still portrays the influence and importance of Mexican tradition and the role of women during the revolution and the years to follow. Her work is characterized as realistic, and Kahlo herself rejected the label of surrealist, saying, quote, "I never painted dreams, I painted my own reality," end quote. Her work portraying women, specifically their strength and independence, was exemplary of what was occurring in society during this time. During the revolution, quote, "Women became leaders in the fights launched by the Maderistas, and many of them were jailed or assassinated." In May 1911, the New York Times observed that women have taken a spectacular part in the revolution, end quote. Women were taking charge of many of the social movements in Mexico during and after the revolution, which can be seen clearly in the representation of Mexican national and indigenous traditions in Kahlo's paintings. One of her most famous works, The Two Fridas, reflects the multiple roles that women had during and after the revolution in Mexico. Similarly, the sentiments captured in the photography of Las Adelitas also showed the spirit of the women in Mexico who participated in the revolution. Comandanta Esther, a member of the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, explained, quote, "I saw that it was necessary to fight, because if I didn't do anything, other brothers and sisters would keep on dying, and I decided. And not only me, there are women who decided to be soldiers, and those women now have the insurgent rank of captain, of major, of lieutenant. So there we see that yes, women can." End quote. Las Adelitas, quote, "brigades of women soldiers continue defending the best values of Mexico," end quote, and hold prominent roles in Mexican society. Although there was a lot of feminicide taking place during the revolution, which caused the separation of many families, the rise of women after the revolution is apparent in the policy changes for women's rights. Las Adelitas were just the beginning of the wave of strong women taking a stand for their rights, traditions, and beliefs in Mexico, and it was luckily documented throughout the revolution. Although there were many different art forms that had significant influence during this time, Posada, Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, and Las Adelitas are four of the most important and influential artists and photographs that captured the revolutionary spirit of Mexico. In discussing the Mexican Revolution, one would be leaving out a crucial part if the artwork and photographs of these people and Las Adelitas was left out. This artwork enhances our present-day knowledge and understanding of how drastically life was changing during this time and how people were responding, which leads to better knowledge of the revolution as a whole. As they say, a picture or a painting is worth 1,000 words.
Combatiendo en la guerrilla, allá en Chihuahua, Parral y la Boquilla. Al ver el campo tan triste y solitario, donde se muere sin agua la semilla, los campesinos